No trial in the history of humanity has ever ended with a consequence comparable to the crucifixion and execution of Jesus in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago.
The case reached the Roman court, and he was sentenced to death.
Today they are rushing the judgment. Those who were supposed to recognize him failed to recognize him. Those who were supposed to administer justice failed to do so. Ultimately, who is responsible for the death of Christ? In order to bring the real history back to life, we must reconstruct in detail the events that unfolded during the preceding days. 33 years have passed since the birth of Christ. Thousands of people arrive in Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. On Sunday, Jesus arrives and enters Jerusalem as the Messiah.
On Monday, he drives the merchants out of the temple and accuses them of defiling the holy place.
The next day, the chief priests convene a secret meeting. At the meeting, they conclude that Jesus poses a threat to their authority. He must be stopped. But how?
By Wednesday, they are already growing nervous. On Thursday, a detachment arrests Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane.
The arrested Jesus is taken to the residence of the high priest Caiaphas and then to Pontius Pilate.
In less than 24 hours, Jesus will be sentenced to death. All of this takes place during the most important Jewish holiday, Passover. The principal initiator of the verdict is Caiaphas, the high priest and head of the Sanhedrin. Caiaphas belongs to the elite circle of the Sadducees. It was from this group that the leaders of the Sanhedrin were chosen.
Caiaphas possesses considerable influence and power. Most importantly, he has a reason for wanting Jesus to be executed.
The high priest Caiaphas led the Sanhedrin of Jerusalem for 18 years. This was unprecedented in the history of the Sanhedrin. Other high priests remained in office for far shorter periods. Caiaphas was also an experienced and far-sighted politician, which is why cooperation and maintaining relations with the Roman authorities were not difficult for him.
How credible is it that the decision to execute Jesus was made in less than 24 hours? Georgian chronicles also offer an interesting answer to this question in historiography.
According to these chronicles, long before Passover, the Jews of Mtskheta received a message from Jerusalem instructing them that they were required to come to Jerusalem for the holiday.
One of the reasons for this mandatory visit was that the Jews of Mtskheta were expected to attend the execution of a man who called himself the Son of God, and who, according to the accusation, rejected the law of Moses.
If we consider how much time it would have taken for a letter to travel from Jerusalem to Mtskheta, and then for the Jews of Mtskheta to make their way to Jerusalem, the natural assumption arises that the decision to execute Jesus Christ was not made spontaneously. Before setting out for Jerusalem, the Jews of Mtskheta already knew that a man who called himself the Messiah was to be put to death. The letter was signed not by Caiaphas, but by another high priest, Annas. According to historical sources, Caiaphas was married to Annas's daughter, meaning that Annas was Caiaphas's father-in-law. He was an extraordinarily influential and authoritative figure in the Jewish world.
When Jesus was arrested, he was first taken precisely to Annas. Although Annas was no longer officially high priest, he still possessed enormous influence in Judea. People listened to him, and he also had considerable influence over the activities of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin controlled important spheres of Jewish religious and civil life. Strict control also existed over the revenues of the temple. On the second day after entering Jerusalem, Jesus drives the merchants out of the temple and challenges the order that had been established there.
It was precisely in the temple that Jesus took one of his most radical steps. He criticized those who traded in and around the temple and declared that the place was losing its true purpose.
It was precisely in the temple that Jesus took one of his most radical steps. He criticized those who traded in and around the temple and declared that the place was losing its true purpose.
This was a rather expensive procedure. Archaeologists have discovered around 150 ritual pools around the Temple of Jerusalem. It is understandable why Jesus' actions angered the temple authorities. In simple terms, Jesus was telling them that they were not behaving and living according to the way prescribed in the Old Testament. Caiaphas became alarmed. Jesus had chosen the most important possible period for this confrontation, the days before Passover, when Jews from across the country gathered in Jerusalem. Caiaphas would not allow either his own authority or that of the Sanhedrin to be undermined in front of so many people.
The Jewish historian Josephus Flavius wrote that during one Passover, 255,600 sheep were sacrificed in the Temple of Jerusalem. According to him, approximately 2.5 million Jews lived in Judea.
The Sanhedrin regulated the Jewish way of life. To put it very simply, it possessed both legal and religious authority.
A conflict between Jesus of Nazareth, on the one hand, and the Jewish chief priests of the time, on the other, was inevitable, because Jesus' actions provoked their dissatisfaction. The name of Jesus had long been known both inside and outside the Sanhedrin. They could see that people listened to him and followed him. Jesus became especially popular after raising Lazarus from the dead. This was an event witnessed by many people. When he raised Lazarus from the dead, we can already see that everyone knew his name. Bethany is close to Jerusalem. Countless people traveling to Passover would have had to pass through Bethany. The raising of Lazarus became the final straw. Why? Because people believed that Jesus truly was the Messiah. His opponents, however, believed that he could become the leader of a possible rebellion and that, first and foremost, he threatened their authority. What right does someone from Galilee have to criticize a tradition that has existed for so many centuries, especially at such a crowded time? What does this mean, and what will he do tomorrow? The first trial before the crucifixion took place in the house of Caiaphas. Before Caiaphas, however, Jesus was taken to the high priest Annas. When Annas asked him what he had been preaching, Jesus answered, "Everyone knows. I have done nothing secretly. I have said everything publicly. Bring the people and ask them." This answer would have angered Annas. They wanted to prove that, according to Jewish law, Jesus deserved death. The Gospel tells us that Caiaphas was the high priest who declared, "If this continues and we do not stop Jesus, the whole nation will follow him."
A discussion begins about where and how this could be carried out. If Jesus were killed during the Passover festival, a rebellion might break out. One way or another, Caiaphas decided that Jesus had to be eliminated. There was also a betrayer among Jesus' disciples. After this, Caiaphas could know precisely where and how Jesus and his disciples would be moving.
Jesus knows beforehand what awaits him in Jerusalem. On the night of the Last Supper, on Thursday, he foretells his own death. He tells his disciples that the bread and wine will symbolize his body and his shed blood. He also identifies the disciple who will betray him only a few hours later.
After this, Jesus and his disciples go to the Mount of Olives, to the Garden of Gethsemane. This is where the most dramatic moments begin.
At this moment, Jesus begins his most important prayer. As God incarnate as man, he must be able to endure and contain everything. He saw the sins of all humanity. That is why he fell to the ground. So heavy was this inner cross that before reaching Golgotha, he first had to pass through the invisible cross of Gethsemane.
The Gospel of Luke tells us how difficult this prayer and these moments were. It describes drops of sweat mixed with blood falling from Jesus to the ground.
Luke, the author of the Gospel, was a physician by profession. What did Luke describe? A metaphor or actual bloody sweat? What does modern medicine say?
Hematohydrosis is a medical condition in which blood and sweat are excreted together from the body. Under extremely severe stress, it is possible for blood from tiny blood vessels beneath the skin, especially around the face, to emerge together with sweat.
The silence of the Garden of Gethsemane was broken by the sound of a detachment approaching. It was the temple guard, which had come to arrest Jesus. The captured Jesus is taken to the house of Caiaphas, where the trial begins. It is believed that from this moment, Caiaphas begins violating the law, and that, from a legal perspective, the proceedings involve procedural violations. Several important rules were violated during the trial at Caiaphas's house. First, under Jewish law, a court session could not be held at night. Second, a court session had to be held in the appropriate court building. Third, and most importantly, a trial could not take place during a religious festival. The law categorically prohibited this.
All four Gospels tell us about this trial. Caiaphas was both the accuser and the chief judge. It was necessary for other judges to confirm the legality of the proceedings as well. Therefore, Caiaphas summons those whom he considers necessary. 2 witnesses were also found, but their contradictory testimonies created an awkward situation. Caiaphas therefore chooses another strategy and directly asks Jesus, "Are you the Son of God? Are you the Messiah?" According to the Gospel of Mark, Jesus answers affirmatively.
If this had been an honest trial, naturally the court should have begun considering whether this man might actually be telling the truth. If he truly was the Messiah, then the first duty of the Sanhedrin and of true Jews would have been to accept him. Instead, Caiaphas declares that this man deserves death because he is guilty of blasphemy. Jewish law did indeed provide the death penalty for blasphemy. Caiaphas had Jesus imprisoned and scheduled another meeting of the Sanhedrin for the following morning. A certain amount of time was supposed to pass before the sentence could be carried out. But another circumstance arises here. Israel at that time was not an independent and sovereign state, and the authority to impose the death penalty was no longer in Jewish hands.
The representative of Roman authority in Judea was Pontius Pilate. He commanded 6,000 legionaries in Jerusalem and approximately 30,000 soldiers in Syria.
Everyone knew that Pilate did not like the Jews and had little respect for the Sanhedrin. His relationship with Caiaphas was particularly tense, as Caiaphas often tried to interfere with his authority.
Pilate was required to be present in Jerusalem for the Passover festival. This was part of his official duty. It was precisely during these days that the situation in Judea became especially tense. This was the main Jewish holiday, and Jews living in different parts of the world tried to gather at the main temple in Jerusalem.
During Passover, rebellious groups also frequently demanded freedom. Suppressing possible unrest and rebellion was Pilate's direct responsibility. Pilate had agents everywhere. Through them, he already knew that Jesus had been tried at Caiaphas' house during the night. He also knew what had happened in the temple, what Jesus had done, and that he had a large number of followers. He had also been informed that Caiaphas' court had sentenced Jesus to death. After the nighttime proceedings, Caiaphas sent Jesus to Pilate because official authorization for an execution belonged to the Roman representative.
The Sanhedrin had to find some way to have the death sentence carried out, so they
chose the path of pressure on the people, misleading them, and provoking the Roman representative. Caiaphas' original accusation, blasphemy, had no direct relevance under Roman law. Pilate, as Rome's representative, could take judicial action against Jesus only if he were accused of rebellion against the state or rejection of Roman authority, for example, if Jesus declared himself king of the Jews. Caiaphas understood this nuance of Roman law very well, and therefore reframed the accusation in political terms. They claim that Jesus is also an enemy of Rome because he calls himself king of the Jews. By their logic, this would amount to a challenge to the authority of the Roman emperor. Roman trials were generally public and held openly before society. News quickly spread throughout the city that Jesus was being questioned, and people began to gather.
Pilate first had to interrogate Jesus. He asks him whether he is the king of the Jews. After questioning him, Pilate finds no crime and declares that Jesus is not guilty.
Pilate could have closed the case right there, but he was forced to take into account a completely unexpected factor: the crowd. The decision to acquit Jesus angered part of the gathered crowd. Shouts began, "Crucify him!"
Pilate could have released Jesus, and formally no one could have challenged him for doing so.
But there is a question. Was this crowd being controlled or incited by Caiaphas and the other chief priests? Pilate found himself facing a dilemma.
Large financial and political resources circulated in Judea. One later example of this can be seen in the wars fought against Rome. All of this demonstrates how significant the political capabilities within the region were. If Pilate releases Jesus, uncontrollable events might begin. But why should he punish an innocent man? Pilate found himself in an extremely difficult position.
He did not want to completely destroy his relationship with the Sanhedrin and, most likely, compromised with his own conscience. According to a tradition associated with the festival, Pilate offers the people the opportunity to pardon one of those sentenced to death. The choice must be made between Barabbas and Jesus. Barabbas had been accused of murder and rebellion. At this point, another interesting episode appears in the Gospel, the story of Pilate's wife. His wife informs Pilate that she had a dream and asks him not to harm this innocent man.
Pilate is ultimately driven into a dead end by both the crowd and the chief priests.
They warn Pilate, "If you do not punish him, we will tell Caesar that you are not his friend, because this man calls himself a king." Finally, Pilate washes his hands before the crowd as a sign that he does not accept responsibility for the death of this innocent man.
Jesus is then taken toward Golgotha. According to tradition, a heavy wooden beam was placed upon him. Jesus was crucified, and several hours later, he was declared dead. But some of the most interesting events continue afterward. Pilate was later summoned to Rome to answer for his harsh treatment of the Jewish population. However, the trial never took place, Emperor Tiberius died, and the case collapsed. Later historical sources no longer give a precise answer regarding Pilate's fate. There is a version according to which he committed suicide. However, there is also a Christian tradition according to which Pilate repented and ultimately died as a martyr. This tradition is preserved especially strongly by the Ethiopian Church. An interesting account concerning Pilate is also preserved in Georgian written tradition. It appears in the Sinai Polycephalon, dated to the 9th century. The collection contains a text connected with Saint Stephen the Protomartyr. According to this text, in the 4th year of Pilate's governorship, Stephen, who had been sentenced to death, was brought before Pilate, but Pilate did not execute him.
Moreover, according to the tradition, Pilate seated Stephen beside him and asked, "Pray for me as well, so that I too may join those who believe in Christ." Pilate refused to execute Stephen.
Later, Stephen was stoned to death. His body was initially left unburied, but later Christians secretly buried him at night. After this event, according to the Sinai Polycephalon, Pilate and his wife went to the place where St. Stephen had been buried, but they could not find the grave. Pilate and his wife wept and asked St. Stephen for mercy, praying that they might become worthy of faith in Christ.
The Sinai Polycephalon continues the story. That same night, Stephen appeared to Pilate and advised him to receive baptism. According to the tradition, Pilate and his wife went to the Apostle Peter and were baptized by his hand.
Caiaphas, one of the principal supporters of Jesus' execution, was later removed from office. The high priesthood passed to one of his relatives, the son of Annas.
After being taken down from the cross, the body of Jesus was buried in a tomb. When his disciples arrived there on the 3rd day, the body was no longer there.
From this point, according to Christian belief, begins the central chapter in the history of Christ's resurrection and of Christianity itself.
One of the best-known relics associated with the resurrection is considered to be the Shroud of Turin, on which traces of a human body and wounds have been preserved. The Georgian Times documentary film studio gives you the opportunity to contribute to the discovery and restoration of Georgian civilization.